بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شلونكم طلابنا طالباتنا؟ Part 2 of the epidemiological lecture 7 and 8. The analysis and interpretation of case control study. To illustrate the case control study, first step is to present the data in a 2x2 table like this one. We have here a group of patient, of cases and control. We will discuss here the possibility of parental smoking and its effect on the occurrence of pneumonia in patient and its effect on the control. So parent smoking was positive in about 170 cases and positive also in the control in 200 cases, and it was negative in 70 cases and in control it was negative in 180. The total number of cases here is 240 and the control number 380. Step 2 is to calculate the percentage of smokers, which means here the risk exposure of the parents of both the cases and control. And the percentage of a smoker, how we can calculate it? Here we have the number of affected patients, the cases on the total number. It was 240 multiplied by 100 and it was here 70.8%. And the smoker parents of control was 200 over 380, which is the total patient of the control. Sorry, the control, they are not patient. And the result was 52.6. So it is clear that here the habit of smoking was more frequent among those of cases than the control. Third step here, to measure the strength of association between parental smoking and the acute respiratory infection, which is pneumonia here, and we use the odd ratio. Odd ratio here, it is the case, number of case or exposed multiplied by the control not exposed over the cases not exposed multiplied by control exposed, and the result was 2.2, which means the risk of acute pneumonia among children with the smoking parents is double or more than double the risk among the non-smoking. Fourth step here is to perform a suitable statistical test to ascertain any significant association, and we usually use the chi-square test. It is possible to estimate the attributable risk in case control study by using the following formula. Here, attributable risk is equals to the B, which is a proportion of people in general population with a risk factor, and we have to multiply by the R minus 1, which is the difference between the odd ratio minus 1, over the B multiplied by R minus 1 plus 1. And the result here was 0.33 or 33%. Okay, assuming that the proportion of a smoker was 0.4 or it is 40%. This is regarding the case control study. Now we will discuss the cohort study. What do you mean by cohort? Cohort is a type of analytic study which is undertaken to obtain additional evidence to refuse means refuse or to support as existence of association between the suspected cases and suspected cause and the disease. Other names of cohort is the longitudinal study or incidence study or the forward-looking study. So the framework of cohort study here, we have a population cohort. We divided them to exposed population and the unexposed, and each one of them is also divided to the disease and the non-diseased groups, the exposed and non-exposed. Example of a prospective cohort study. We have a prospective, retrospective and other type, which is combined type. Framingham heart disease study initiated in 1948 to study the relationship of the variety of factors to subsequent development of heart disease. This study done with a 5,127 sample ages between 30 to 59 years at Framingham, and the study subject examined every 2 years for 20 years. So it is a long period, high number of patients, a long period. This is one of the character of cohort. They use high number of patients and for long duration. But here it is for prospective study, means forward study. Daily surveillance of the hospitalization at Framingham Hospital. Study found that hypertension, tobacco smoking, elevated blood cholesterol are associated to congestive heart disease. And increased physical activity associated with decreased risk of congestive heart disease. This is an example of a prospective cohort study. Okay, this is another example. Here, this is 117,000 nurses checked for evidence of they have no disease till now, they have no cancer, and they have no cardiovascular disease. And they check risk factor, and they divided them to groups. Two groups, one have risk factor and the other haven't this risk factor. And here we start, the researcher start the study from the normal group population. They are normal, they didn't have the disease yet, but they are exposed to risk factor. Some of them exposed and the other not. And then try to check, is there any relation between obesity or leanness between these two factors or variants with the appearance of cancer and the cardiovascular disease in the future. So this is another type of a prospective cohort study. Now we will discuss the retrospective cohort study. Here it is one in which the outcome has all occurred before the start of investigation. So the patient here is, they got the disease, either they diseased or being dead. Here at the beginning of the study, the outcome is observed in all patients, while in the retrospective it was not observed. Investigators go back to the past. Here, as this investigator, he will pass to the past, and then he will take information, study a group from existing toward the past employment. As here in this study, the employees of a tire manufacturer, they checked, they had factor or they didn't have factor. They had factor like tire markers, and they didn't have the factor like clerical staff. Clerical staff, they are the written staff, only they didn't work in the factory, just the written work. And they compare the incidence of death and disease in both groups. Okay, so other name is a historical cohort, or it is a non-current cohort. They took the history from this manufacturer, and they took the history from the manufacturer about the tire maker and about the other staff, and they study their incidence of diseases or even death, and this is the type of historical cohort. And this is the example, the same example. And M.D. directional cohort study. This type of study, it included both of them, retrospective part and the prospective part. Suppose you have a study like that of the tire manufacturing, and we start the study from a certain point backward, and then we check the tire manufacturer staff and the written or the clerical staff, and reaching this point. Here we found the number of death and number of disease and the prognosis, but we want to continue on this study, on a prospective part of a study, for another 10 years maybe, for evidence of appearance of maybe here they got a skin rash, but also we have to check for another possibility of cancer because of exposure to a rubber industry or rubber factory. So we need to know that there are two parts in this study. We called it the M.D. directional cohort study. So what's cohort? Cohort is a group of individuals who share common characteristic or experience, people who are free from the disease. They are free from disease. They are not diseased people. Such people are identified and followed up for a defined period of time. During the follow-up, new cases or death that result from the disease under study are recorded and related to different levels of exposure to risk factor. So they are free from disease, and we follow them either retrospectively or prospectively to find the relation between any risk factor and the appearance of the disease, or maybe the new cases occur, or maybe death occur, and to continue and to find the relation between the exposure to that risk factor or exposure or event under evaluation. So we always start with at least two groups, the study cohort, and here we never name them the cases. They are study cohort, which consists of those exposed to risk factor, and the control cohort, which consists of those not exposed to risk factor. So, for example, we have a study carried out at a certain relationship of parental smoking to the risk of acute respiratory infection among children aged less than 5 years. A total of 800 children of smoking parents and 1,200 of non-smoking parents were followed up for 6 months. During the follow-up period, 592 of the first group we mean of the smoking parents, and 636 of the second group non-smoking parents developed at least one attack of acute respiratory infection. Do these results suggest that parental smoking predisposes children to acute respiratory infection? This is the question. So to answer, we have to start with finding the incidence rate in both two cohort groups. The incidence rate among children exposed to parental smoking was 592 over the total number 800 multiplied by 1000, and the result was 740 per 1000. And the incidence rate among children not exposed parental smoking was, as you see in the formula, the result was here 530 per 1000. So it is clear now that the incidence of infection is greater among the exposed rather than the non-exposed. And here we have the number, the smoker, and the total number of the exposed smoker group, and we have here the non-smoker and the total number. Okay, so the second step is to measure the strength of association between the parent smoking and the infection by calculating the relative and attributable risk. Relative risk is the division of the incidence rate among exposed over the incidence rate among non-exposed, and it was here 1.4, which means the risk of infection among exposed children to parent smoking is 1.4 times greater than the risk of infection among children not exposed to parental smoking. So in addition to the relative risks, we also measure the attributable risks, which represent a fraction of risk that could be attributed to exposure. How many times the exposure increased the incidence rate of the disease among them. So attributable risk is we calculated from the incidence rate among exposed minus the incidence rate among the non-exposed, and it was here 210 among 1000. So this fraction is equivalent to the magnitude of the reduction in incidence. There is reduction in incidence if the exposure is eliminated, okay, or it is increment if the exposure is present. So reduction in incidence if the exposure is eliminated can be expressed in percentage reduction as follows. The percentage reduction in the risk is equivalent to, as we said here, this is the attributable risk over the total number multiplied by 100, and it was here 28.4. Okay. Note that the relative risk is not very high. It is only 1.4, which means a relatively weak association, and therefore the expected reduction in the risk incidence rate in exposed to the elimination of exposure that stopping parent smoking is relatively low, only 28.4%. As in control study, we need a chi-square study, which is a statistical test to perform the result. So the source of control in analytic study in cases of control study, the main source are case control. Okay, it is the total population in a given area, the whole population in the area, and relative and neighbors, hospital patients other than those with the disease under study, mean cases with disease which may be related to the risk factor under study must not be used as a control, and associate of cases in a place of residence, schools, and workplace. These are the sources of the case control study. In cohort study, the main sources are built-in comparative cohorts, as for example, in studying the relationship of lung cancer to smoking, people may be categorized into subgroups of heavy smoker, moderate smoker, light smoker, and non-smoker. So we have to build the information in comparative cohort. The main sources of information here is the relative and neighbors, the total population, and the special occupational group. This is a comparison of case control and the cohort study. We have regarding the number of subjects in case control, it is small, while in cohort large. The time short here and it is long in cohort. Cost, lower cost, higher cost for cohort. Organization, it is easier for organization in case control and more difficult in cohort. Interpretation of result more difficult while it is easier in cohort. And usefulness of the rare disease, usually it is used here a case control for rare disease, but it for cohort not used. And bias is likely in ascertainment of exposure in case control, and it is bias appear for diagnosis. And usefulness of risk measurements less useful in case control, whether it is more useful in cohort. Usefulness of causal criteria less useful for cohort, control, case control, and it is very useful in cohort. And the risk to subjects usually none, and risk of not removing risk factor. This is an example for the cohort type study and the case control. As we said, in case control, the researcher started from two categories. One of them of population, one of them are diseased already and the other non-diseased, and he go back to check, compare the prior exposure, maybe for malignancy, and compare the exposure to radiation or to some certain of materials that increase the risk of malignancy like asbestos and else. While in cohort studies here we have two groups. They are not affected, they are not diseased, but we will expose this group and not expose the other, so they are not diseased. And for the future we are going to check the patient from being well till the appearance of disease or the events, and we have to compare these again together, the incidence rate of both. Thank you very much.